Those of you here at headquarters and those of you who are watching us in the webcast for our quarterly. We've assembled a stimulating agenda and a stellar panel today, moderated by our own Brian Green, a General Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. As has been our tradition, we're going to begin with Kevin Kane, PD&R's Chief Market Analyst, who's going to update us on the state of the U.S. housing market and with news from the first quarter of 2014. But before that, after that, we're going to move to our panel discussion. Okay, so this is my first quarterly briefing ever, just so you know. Got to get the order right. Kevin goes first, then our panel. And the panel today is going to be discussing expanding opportunity through fair housing choice, which relates to our current Evidence Matters publication, which is available online, but at the end of the month you can get a hard copy for. So let's start with just a theme of the panel before I move to Kevin. So eliminating discrimination from the nation's housing markets and reducing residential segregation are essential components of HUD's mission to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. As we all know, place matters for a whole range of outcomes and life chances. The persistence of discrimination, albeit frequently in more subtle forms than decades ago, and continued high levels of segregation are fundamental barriers to equal opportunity in this country. HUD cannot make substantial progress on its mission without addressing both of these fair housing issues, discrimination and persistent segregation, regardless of the cause of the segregation. Earlier this week, Brian and I had the inordinate pleasure of attending the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, hosted by the Department of Justice and Howard University. It was an amazing event, and I believe you can actually see it telecast later this month. It was truly moving and humbling, and a poignant reminder of all the work that has already been done, the people on whose shoulders our current work stands, and all of the work that still remains. And so today's panel and discussion lets us focus on the housing component of civil rights, near and dear to our heart here at HUD. Before we move to the panel, I'm going to turn over the podium to Kevin. And that's it. Brief remarks.
Thank you, Dr. O'Regan. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to those folks who are watching on the webcast. For those people watching on the webcast, there's no need to adjust your monitors. This is the way that I look. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Randall Goodnight, Wendy Ip, Ben Hoke, Elaine Ng, and Holly Woods Weaver, who were the team who put together all the maps that you'll see in my presentation this afternoon. Just a note about the maps, the color themes of the maps are all the same, where brown indicates worse off conditions or declines in a variable, and blue indicates better conditions or increases. First, we're going to discuss the nation's economy. Then I'm going to give a little brief discussion of population changes. We'll talk about the nation's sales markets, and then talk about the nation's rental markets. So this first figure shows the year-over-year percentage change in non-farm payrolls since 2004. This is looking at both the 12-month and 3-month averages through March of 2014. Non-farm payrolls are a measure of jobs in the nation, and the 12-month average in blue shows an annual change and is a more stable measure of economic performance. The 3-month average change, shown in red, is a good indicator for where things are heading. During the 12 months ending March 2014, non-farm payrolls averaged 136.9 million jobs. This was up 1.7%, or 2.3 million jobs compared with a year ago. The 3-month average was also up by 1.7% from a year ago. The rates for both of these series have been relatively stable since June of 2012, and you can see that with the flattening of the curve. For the 12th consecutive quarter, every region in the country added jobs relative to a year ago, so the entire country is shown in blue. 5 regions grew at a rate that was faster than the national average. Those are shown in the darker blue: the Rocky Mountains, Pacific, Southwest, Northwest, and Southeast. For the sixth consecutive quarter, growth was slowest in the Mid-Atlantic region at 0.4%. Relative to a year ago, the rates of growth were up or the same in 4 regions, and they were lower in 6 regions. The largest gains occurred in New England and the Great Plains, which were both up by 0.2 percentage points from a year ago. Let's take a closer look at the Southeast Caribbean region by metropolitan area. Year-over-year growth in this region during the first quarter was 1.8%. This was the first time since the first quarter of 2012 that the rate of growth for this region was faster than the national rate. Growth was led by a 6.1% increase in the construction subsector and a 3.6% increase in the professional and business services sector. The 8 areas in the darkest shade of blue grew by more than twice as fast as the national average, with rates above 3.5%, and that includes Anderson, South Carolina, Naples and Orlando, Florida, as well as Raleigh and Wilmington, North Carolina. Areas in the medium shade of blue also grew faster than the national average, and that includes Jacksonville, Nashville, and Miami, with rates of growth above 3%. Atlanta and Tampa had rates of 2.2 and 2.5% respectively. The national unemployment rate was 6.9% during the first quarter of 2014. This was down from 8.1% a year ago. The 5 regions in blue had a rate that was less than or equal to the national rate, led by the Rocky Mountains at 5.5%. The 5 regions in brown had a higher rate than the national average, led by the Pacific at 8.3%. On a state level, 8 states have a rate that's lower than 5%, led by North Dakota at 3.3%, and Rhode Island has the highest rate in the country at 9.5%. On a national level, the unemployment rate during the first quarter of 2014 was down 1.2 percentage points from last year. The unemployment rate declined in every region of the country and in 46 states. The largest decline occurred in the Southeast Caribbean at 1.4 percentage points. There are 2 factors that cause a decline in the unemployment rate. Either gains in employment, which is a good thing, or perhaps people leaving the labor force, which is not so good and something we call discouraged workers. On a national level, the resident employment was up 1.5%, while the labor force was relatively unchanged with a 0.2% increase. So what does this mean? Well, let's take a look at a state level map showing the change in labor force from a year ago. You can see there's a definite pattern along the eastern U.S. of a decline in the labor force, those states shown in brown. 19 states had a decline, and 8 of those states were by nearly 1% or more. As the economy grows, we want more people to be drawn back into the labor force, so hopefully we'll see this trend change in the near future. So while we're looking at things on a state level, the new census population estimates for 2013 are now available. This map shows the change in population from 2012 to 2013. The national population increase was 0.7%. Population was up everywhere except the lone state, West Virginia, shown in brown, which had a slight decline of 0.1%, and there was also no change in Maine. States in the 2 darker shades of blue increased faster than the national average, and that was led by a 3.1% increase in North Dakota, which was a result of increased oil and gas exploration, and a 2.1% increase in the District of Columbia, which was not a result of oil and gas exploration. Let me give an overview of current housing market conditions. Sales market conditions remain balanced throughout most of the country, but are beginning to show some signs of slight tightening in some markets. For a bit of background, balanced conditions exist when the quantity of housing supplied equals the quantity demanded. Soft markets occur when the quantity of housing supplied exceeds the quantity demanded and we have a surplus. And tight markets occur when demand exceeds supply and we have a shortage. All 3 home price indices show that home sales prices continued to increase during the first quarter of 2012. However, the rates of growth have declined in 2 out of the 3 indexes, and they were unchanged in the 3rd. Existing home sales increased by 6.1% during the 12 months ending March 2012, and that's according to CoreLogic data. This was a slowdown from an 8% increase last year. Inventories of new homes for sale were up by 25% from a year ago, and they were up 3% for existing homes. And based on the current rate of home sales, there's a 6-month supply of new homes compared with a 4.2-month supply a year ago, and there's a 5.2 months supply of existing homes compared with a 4.7 months supply a year ago. The sales vacancy rate was 2% in the first quarter. This was down from 2.1% a year ago. Rental market conditions continue to tighten throughout the country. An estimated 64% of new apartments that were completed during the fourth quarter of 2013 were absorbed within 3 months. This was up from 61% a year ago. And multifamily production increased by 20% in the first quarter relative to a year ago. Let's take a look now at regional conditions. These are assessments provided by our field economists. Relative to last quarter, improvements in an area are shown in blue, and declines in the conditions are shown in brown. While sales market conditions remain balanced in most of the countries, some areas are seeing some tightening. Conditions were mixed in the Mid-Atlantic and Pacific, from slightly soft to tight. In the Rocky Mountains, it was slightly tight after being previously balanced last quarter. And in the Northwest, previously mixed conditions are now considered balanced. Rental market conditions are also showing signs of tightening, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, Southwest, and Northwest, where some markets now are considered very tight. Conditions improved in New York and New Jersey, as well as in the Midwest, where things are now balanced. For the 8th consecutive quarter, all 3 home price indices show an increase relative to a year ago. The Case-Shiller Index, which is shown in blue, was up by 10.3%. The FHFA Index, shown in red, was up by 6.6%, and the CoreLogic Index, shown in black, was up by 11.4%. The rates of growth for Case-Shiller and FHFA declined relative to the previous quarter, and actually 2 quarters of decline for the FHFA Index. The CoreLogic Index has remained relatively unchanged for about 4 quarters. And you can see that with the line flattening out on the right. This next map shows the change in the CoreLogic average home sales price during the 12 months ending March 2014 compared with the previous 12 months. Nationally, the average increase was 9.1%, with prices up in every single region, again, the whole country in blue. The 4 regions in the darker shade of blue increased at a faster rate than the national average, led by the Pacific, up 17.4%. Prices were up in every state, and 8 states had double-digit price increases, led for the 3rd consecutive quarter by Nevada and California, where prices were up by 22% and 19%. According to the Census Bureau, the median price of a new home in the first quarter was $265,700. This was up 3% from a year ago. And according to the National Association of Realtors, the median price of an existing home was $191,600. This was up 9% from a year ago. This next map shows the price changes in the Pacific region at the metropolitan level during the first quarter of 2014. This map shows 41 metropolitan areas, and prices were up in every area except for one, Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is shown in brown. 35 of the 41 areas increased at a faster rate than the national average, and you can see those in the 2 darker shades of blue. Prices in 13 of those areas grew by more than 20%. Those are in the darkest blue, and that included Los Angeles, Reno, Sacramento, Las Vegas, Oakland, and Stockton. This next map shows the percent of home loans that are 90 or more days delinquent, in foreclosure, or an REO as of March 2014. REO stands for real estate owned, which means that the lender now owns the property. The national average was 5.2% of all loans in those 3 categories. This was down from 7% a year ago. The 4 regions in brown have a rate that's higher than the national average, while the 6 regions in blue are below the national average. For the 3rd consecutive quarter, the rate declined in every region of the country and also declined in every state, with the most dramatic decline in the Southeast, down 2.8 percentage points, led by a 5.2% decline in Florida, while the rate there still remains more than 10%. Let's take a closer look at the Pacific region, which has the 2nd lowest level of distressed loans in the country behind the Rocky Mountains. This map shows the change from a year ago. The rate was down in all 41 of the metropolitan areas. You can see those all in blue. The 23 areas in the two darkest shades of blue have declined faster than the national average, led by a 4.7% decline in Las Vegas. Existing home sales increased by 6.1% during the 12 months ending March 2014 compared with a year ago. And again, this according to CoreLogic data. Sales increased in every region except the Pacific, which was down by 3.8%, the rest of the country in blue. The 6 regions in dark blue increased at a faster rate than the national average. Relative to last quarter, the rates of growth were down in every region except New York, New Jersey. For the third consecutive quarter, the largest increase in sales occurred in the Northwest, which was up by 12.6%, followed by the Southeast, up 11%. And just to note, not shown on the map, new home sales were down by 3.2% according to the Census Bureau, and existing homes, according to the National Association of Realtors, were down by 6.6%. So their data is showing a slightly different trend than what the CoreLogic data is showing. Let's take a closer look at the Southeast region, which had the second highest increase in the country at 11%. In that region, new home sales were up by 19%. This was the largest increase in new home sales in the country. Traditional resales were up by 16%, and short sales were down by 13%. Total sales were down in only 6 of the 91 areas, those shown in the 2 shades of brown. And the areas in dark blue were up by more than the national average, including almost all of Florida and Georgia, and all the major metropolitan areas of the region. Single-family home building, as measured by building permits issued, remained unchanged in the first quarter at 125,600 units. In New York, New Jersey, they had a gain of 22%, which was balanced out by declines of 10% in the Mid-Atlantic and the Great Plains regions, with relatively modest changes in the other regions of the country. The number of multifamily units permitted was up by 20% to 85,900 units during the first quarter. Increases occurred in 8 regions and ranged from 2% in the Southwest to 58% in New York, New Jersey. Gains of more than 40% occurred in the Midwest and the Great Plains. The number of multifamily units permitted declined in New England and in the Northwest. Vacancy rates continue to decline throughout much of the country. You can see those in the 3 shades of brown dots, although the rate of decline is slowing. According to Reese data, which covers 275 market areas, vacancy rates were down in 180 areas, shown in brown. That compares with being down in 215 areas last quarter. And they were up in 83 market areas this quarter, those dots shown in blue. That compares with being up in 48 areas last quarter. So there's definitely some changes going on in the rental markets. The vacancy rates remained unchanged in 12 areas. Those are also shown in blue. The average U.S. vacancy rate declined by 0.4 percentage points from 4.4% in the first quarter of 2013 to 4% in the first quarter of 2014. There were 9 market areas with a decline of 2 percentage points or more. Those are shown in the darkest shade of brown. The light brown areas declined by less than 1%, and the medium brown areas declined between 1% and 2%. The light blue areas increased by 1% or less, and the medium blue increased by 1% to 2%, while the dark blue areas increased by more than 2 percentage points, and you can see that there are 4 of those areas. According to the Census Bureau for the entire U.S., the rental vacancy rate was 8.3% during the first quarter of 2014. This was down from 8.6% a year ago. Of the 9 areas with a decline of 2 percentage points or more, 7 of those were located in the Southeast region. And those, again, are shown in the dark brown dots. Vacancy rates were down in the 49 areas of the Southeast region. They were unchanged in 1, and they were up in 15 areas. The declines in most of the major metropolitan areas were relatively modest, being less than 1%. So how about rents? Rents were up by 3.1% nationally, according to Reese data, from the first quarter of 2013 to the first quarter of 2014. The average market rent for the 275 areas covered was $1,138. Rents increased in 266 of the 275 areas covered. Those are shown in blue. Rates were down or unchanged in the other 9 areas. Areas in light blue increased by less than the national increase, and the 37 areas in dark blue increased by more than the national average. Take a closer look here at the New England region, where rental market conditions have been tight since the third quarter of 2012. Rents in the first quarter were up in all 9 of the metropolitan areas covered, led by a 3.5% increase in Boston, a 2.6% increase in New Haven, and a 2.2% increase in Providence. So in summary, year-over-year job growth for the first quarter was 1.7%. Sales markets are balanced throughout the country, but starting to show some signs of tightening in certain markets. Prices and sales were up, but the rates of gain for both have slowed. Rental market conditions continue to tighten through the country, with rents continuing to rise and vacancy rates continuing to decline. For additional information, you can please go to the U.S. Housing Market Conditions website on huduser.org, talk with your local, regional, or field economist, or you can feel free to contact me. So at this time, I am going to hand things over to Brian Green, who is the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for FHEO, who's going to moderate the panel this afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Green. I'm the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for HUD's Office of Fair Housing. Thanks for joining us for a discussion on expanding opportunity through fair housing choice. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests whose work as practitioners and scholars is valuable to helping HUD fulfill its mission to build inclusive and sustainable communities free from discrimination. I'll introduce our guests in a moment. First, I want to say a few words about HUD and what we endeavor to do in carrying out our mandate to enforce the nation's fair housing laws. Among the principal laws that we enforce are Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, whose 50th anniversary we mark this month, and the Federal Fair Housing Act, which will be our focus today, passed in 1968. The Fair Housing Act went beyond Title VI by prohibiting housing and housing-related transactions, housing and housing-related discrimination in both the public and private housing markets. Moreover, the Fair Housing Act mandates not only that HUD combat discrimination where it occurs, but it also requires that HUD affirmatively further fair housing in all of its programs and activities, and that it take an active role in removing the barriers that perpetuate segregation and impede the goal of the Fair Housing Act to promote inclusive communities. To fulfill the promise of the Fair Housing Act, HUD basically does 3 things. 1, we take actions to prevent discrimination from occurring. 2, we enforce the law where discrimination has occurred or is about to occur. And 3, we develop and implement policies to counteract the legacy of discrimination. In terms of prevention, there are basically 2 main strategies. Educate the housing industry, that includes housing providers, lenders, homeowners insurance companies. And it's great, of course, if you can prevent discrimination in the first place. But we also educate consumers. And educated consumers who know their rights and who stand up for their rights helps discourage discriminatory practices. Moreover, aggressive enforcement of the law and the publicity surrounding that enforcement also serves to educate the public and create a deterrent. So when it comes to enforcement, HUD, the Department of Justice, state and local agencies, and private nonprofits all aggressively pursue cases when we uncover discrimination, but the key is uncovering the discrimination. Testing is often our best tool for uncovering discrimination and documenting evidence of it. Testing provides a comparison of how similarly situated persons of different backgrounds are treated when they seek the same housing opportunity. And because testing is so vital to fair housing enforcement, funding for nonprofit groups who conduct testing activities under HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives program is key to Fair Housing Act enforcement at HUD. But the biggest challenge to complaint-based enforcement is that not everyone who encounters discrimination reports it. In fact, very few do. So, first, without testing evidence, many people may not know that they've been discriminated against, and hence don't have any reason to file complaints. Then, more generally, many people don't know their rights. And finally, studies have shown that for a large percentage of people who do know their rights, many still don't pursue those rights because they believe filing a complaint won't make a difference, or they just prefer to move on. So while a great deal of enforcement emanates from complaints filed with government agencies and fair housing groups, an enforcement scheme that responds just to reports of discrimination is ineffective. It's sort of like a game of whack-a-mole where you're trying to address each individual instance but cannot prevent the next one from occurring. And moreover, as I said, it does not address the discrimination that may be occurring but is going unreported. So that's why, as part of our enforcement scheme, we're also bringing secretary-initiated cases. This authority allows us to conduct investigations and bring cases where we have not received a complaint from an individual, but where other investigative activity has revealed discrimination. Or we may expand one of our existing individual complaints to obtain relief for a greater number of people and address a more general practice. One case of where we've done this has been in the work that we have done to address discrimination against women on maternity leave seeking mortgage loans. That began as complaints from individuals, which we expanded into larger complaints of lenders, and has resulted in industry-wide changes in practices. Finally, as I said, HUD is charged not only with enforcement against violators of the law, but we're also obligated to take proactive measures to eliminate barriers to fair housing choice. Towards that end, HUD is ensuring in the operation of its programs and activities that we and our grantees are creating opportunities for people to live in vibrant, thriving, and inclusive communities. We're helping to ensure that having a housing voucher or that living in assisted housing doesn't consign your housing choices only to segregated, high-poverty communities. While at the same time, we are making smart, strategic, and transformative investments in these communities so they become better places to live. Our panelists, through their work, help inform us at HUD how discrimination occurs on the ground and what barriers remain to true housing choice, so we can be sure that we are fashioning the right tools to combat discrimination and promote equal housing opportunity today. So it's my pleasure to introduce the members of this panel. Fred Freiberg is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York City. Diane Levi is the Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute. And Lynn Albright is an Assistant Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at Northeastern University. Just a word about each of our panelists. Fred Freiberg is the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York City, which is a regional civil rights organization that he co-founded in 2004. He's one of the nation's leading experts on the use of testing as an investigative tool to enforce civil rights laws. In his 38 years of work in the fair housing field, he has supervised or participated in thousands of testing investigations involving rental housing, real estate sales, new construction, nursing homes, mobile homes, places of public accommodation, and mortgage lending institutions. Fred has also testified in dozens of fair housing cases, published articles on fair housing, and has received numerous awards for his accomplishments in the fair housing field. He is also the executive producer of a fair housing documentary that we showed here just this year, released last year, called A Matter of Place. In fact, this is Fred's third time speaking at HUD in a year. So that should give you some indication of how valuable his insights are to us here at HUD. And I see Fred sitting in his favorite chair, too. Diane Levi is a senior research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Since joining Urban in 1998, Ms. Levi's work has focused broadly on how low and moderate income housing in neighborhoods, focused broadly on low income and moderate housing, low and moderate income housing and neighborhoods, including studies of housing conditions, the effects of federal and local programs on residents and neighborhoods, implementation and viability of housing provision models such as mixed income housing and affordable housing development via inclusionary zoning, and housing discrimination through pair testing methodologies. Ms. Levi holds master's degrees in anthropology and city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And finally, Lynn Albright is the assistant professor of sociology and public policy and a faculty member in the Urban Sustainability Initiative at Northeastern University. His work focuses on understanding how communities respond to social change, including the impacts of suburban subsidized housing on participants and their communities, the mobility process for subsidized housing residents, and measuring the impact of subprime loans and foreclosures on household wealth. He has also studied how communities respond to environmental change. He worked on the book Climbing Mount Laurel, The Struggle for Affordable Housing and Social Mobility in an American Suburb. He did that research with Douglas Massey, Rebecca Cassiano, Elizabeth Derrickson, and David Kenzie. Mr. Albright received his PhD from the University of Chicago. So we have a great panel. What we're going to do is first we're going to hear from them individually, and then we're going to sit down for a conversation among ourselves and with you, and taking your questions and answers. So why don't we start now with Fred.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank the Office of Policy Development and Research and the new Assistant Secretary O'Regan for the kind invitation to be part of this panel, and thanks again for the third time, to my friend Brian for his kind introduction. I've been asked to address the topic of fair housing enforcement, but before I launch into my remarks, I thought I'd share a local news story with you that an NBC affiliate in New York City aired in May of this year. It involves a case that the Fair Housing Justice Center and several African-American testers filed against a landlord who controls roughly 300 units of rental housing in the Bronx. Could we cue the clip?
And now to an I-Team exclusive. For a white person, there's an apartment for rent. But when a black person inquires, sorry, nothing's available. If that sounds like a script from the civil rights era, think again. Tonight, Chris Glorioso investigates a housing discrimination case you might not believe, except that we have the evidence on tape.
Hi, is there a superintendent?
You are listening to audio obtained exclusively by the I-Team.
Any vacancies?
It seems to show blatant racial discrimination. Listen as a white couple is shown an apartment for rent inside this Bronx building.
Maybe a little more space in the kitchen.
Almost as soon as that white couple turns the apartment down, a black renter wanders up to the lobby.
I'm looking for one bedrooms.
But this time, the rental agent tells a very different story.
We have nothing available right now.
It was seconds after the white couple had been offered the apartment that when I asked about the availability of one-bedroom apartments in the building, he said, oh, there are no one-bedrooms.
We have nothing available right now.
Is there any other explanation for what happened to you than housing discrimination?
No.
John is the black man who was denied. We can't share his identity because both he and the white couple who went to the building before him are part of a secret team of testers from the Fair Housing Justice Center. Each year, they look to catch landlords in the act. lying and denying apartment vacancies whenever minorities inquire.
You don't always know when you're being discriminated against.
Today, housing discrimination is more like a revolving door where people are politely and courteously escorted in, out of, and ultimately away from the desired housing.
Fred Freiberg is executive director of Fair Housing Justice. He uses census data to spot the buildings that seem to have too few minorities. Now he's bringing suit against the owners of 4300 Martha Avenue, the building from which John was turned away.
It seems to me quite clear that race is infecting the practices of this rental housing provider.
The I-Team tried to contact the building landlord, a man named Patrick O'Connell, to ask if he purposely tries to keep black residents out. So far, we haven't heard back. We did speak with one of his longtime tenants who says she's never seen discrimination here.
How could he discriminate when they're living here? It's a lot of nonsense.
40-year tenant Margaret Farrell told us she knows of a black family living in her building. But the fair housing testers say there is no doubt about what happened to them.
It's egregious.
Bianca is another black tester who was told a different story than the white ones.
He made it clear that the apartment was available.
Just seconds after a white couple was shown an apartment in another O'Connell building, Bianca inquired.
Are you showing apartments for this building?
Listen, as the rental agent tells Bianca the apartment was taken by her fellow testers.
Is it possible for me to see it?
It's rented.
I believe it just shows that no matter where you are, there's always going to be some kind of discrimination.
Those fair housing testers say they file about a dozen lawsuits a year demanding landlords treat minorities equally. If you're looking for a home and you suspect discrimination, you can file a housing discrimination complaint with the federal government. For more information on that, you can go to NBCNewYork.com. Reporting from the newsroom, Chris Glorioso, News 4, New York.
Okay. Well, putting aside the somewhat sensationalist reporting over which we had absolutely no control, the pending federal lawsuit in this case, unfortunately, is all too typical of many that FHJC files every year involving systemic housing discrimination based on testing evidence. What is typical is that the housing providers usually have decent, affordable housing units. They never advertise or they selectively advertise rental availabilities. They frequently maintain an office in an unmarked building, and they have invariably devised a clever system for dealing with inquiries that virtually assures that the populations being excluded or treated differently will never file a housing discrimination complaint. In this case, as with many others, we figured out how to structure a testing investigation, something we call a decoy test, which is actually featured in this issue of Evidence Matters, so as to facilitate contact between the testers, the rental manager, and the African-American testers. When we did, we obtained an unambiguous picture of how this housing provider lies to African-American prospective renters about available apartments. Now, how did we identify this housing provider? The Fair Housing Justice Center developed, as the clip showed, a customized GIS mapping program where we take data sets from the U.S. Census and the American Community Survey and map areas to identify what I refer to as areas of interest for systemic testing investigations. In this case, we identified a very small geographic area in the predominantly white Woodlawn neighborhood of the Bronx, which contained a high percentage of rental units in 50-plus unit buildings and a paucity of African-American renters. Once we identify an area of interest like this one, we test all the buildings of that particular size in that area of interest, and we invariably find one or more violators. We've done this successfully throughout New York City and the larger New York region. It allows us, frankly, to more strategically use scarce testing resources to identify violators of fair housing laws and eliminate barriers to housing choice that still exist in the housing market, while opening up housing opportunities to populations that are being excluded. Now, the question is, would a complaint ever get filed against this housing provider? And the answer is clearly no. Violators like the one we identified in this investigation would rarely be the subject of a complaint filed by an ordinary consumer, even though these housing providers collectively control hundreds of thousands of housing units in our region. I delivered a speech last year in this auditorium where I spoke about the three characteristics, or what I've termed the ground truths, about contemporary housing discrimination. One, that some violators elude detection by avoiding or minimizing contact with unwanted populations. 2, that some violators elude detection by unequally applying facially neutral policies to exclude or disqualify unwanted populations. And 3, some violators simply elude detection by camouflaging their discriminatory conduct with common courtesies. These are incidentally the same factors that support my contention that paired testing studies like the housing discrimination study may not be rendering reliable estimates about the level or extent of housing discrimination based on race or national origin. But I digress. So the question is, what do these facts portend for the future of fair housing law enforcement in our nation? If, as a nation, we want to remove discriminatory barriers to housing choice and accelerate reductions in residential racial segregation and all of the attendant and well-documented inequalities, we'll need to consider a new paradigm for fair housing law enforcement work. This new paradigm does not require that we amend the Federal Fair Housing Act, although those of us in the fair housing movement would certainly welcome and embrace additional protections based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and source of income. But it does require that we rethink how those of us who are involved in fair housing law enforcement execute our responsibilities. Here are 3 changes I would recommend. As Brian indicated, a purely complaint-driven response, such as that which is pursued by most government enforcement agencies, is wholly inadequate. The only way to ferret out many of the unlawful discriminatory practices that remain in the private market is to conduct systemic testing investigations. A much greater emphasis must be placed on planned systemic investigations, and testing should be a centerpiece in any enforcement strategy. To the extent that government agencies, number 2, to the extent that government agencies continue to receive complaints of housing discrimination, these agencies must add a testing capability to their investigative arsenal if they do not currently have one. This may require an infusion of resources, additional training, and altering the structure and timing of the intake process by agencies to allow for covert investigations on a case-by-case basis. But we must discontinue the shameful practice of no-causing thousands of complaints every year because the agency simply never bothered to conduct a testing investigation. There is ample evidence after 46 years of enforcement work and case law that the corroborative evidence that comes from testing is more likely to result in favorable outcomes for a complainant. And third, public and private enforcement agencies that conduct both complaint-responsive and systemic testing must use their limited resources in a more creative, strategic, coordinated, and impactful manner by employing technology, by understanding the varieties of types of test structures available which go well beyond paired testing, and by establishing clear and shared enforcement priorities, agencies will be better positioned to make real progress in reducing the level of illegal housing discrimination. Now, some will say that because all public and private agencies are so resource constrained at this time, the changes I'm advocating will simply never be made. But I would suggest to you that for a nation that purports to value civil rights, as people who share Dr. King's vision of a more open, inclusive, and opportunity-driven society, the choice is very clear, and a fairly dramatic structural shift in our enforcement activity is warranted. I also know that political will to take bold action to enforce civil rights laws has been conspicuously missing in our political dialogue and in the halls of power and influence here in Washington. 50 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about the lack of political will, the inclination of many to simply wait or do as little as possible when it comes to enforcing civil rights laws. In his appropriately titled book, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King wrote, quote, "We need a powerful sense of determination to banish the ugly blemish of racism scarring the image of America. We can, of course, try to temporize, negotiate small, inadequate changes, and prolong the timetable of freedom in the hope that the narcotics of delay will dull the pain of progress. We can try, but we will certainly fail. The shape of the world will not permit us the luxury of gradualism and procrastination, not only because it's immoral, but because it simply will not work. Determination and intellectual honesty should prompt all of us to just say no to the narcotics of delay so that we can move forward, as difficult and painful as it might seem at times, to more vigorously and effectively enforce fair housing laws." Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. And also thank you to HUD for inviting me to participate in the panel today. So I work at the Urban Institute, which is a research organization based here in Washington, D.C. And Urban Institute researchers have conducted fair housing-related studies over decades, much of it funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And just a few examples of the work include analyses of racial segregation at neighborhood and city levels, surveys on the public awareness of fair housing laws, as well as pilot and national studies of housing discrimination based on using the paired testing research methods, including the 4 decennial national studies of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities in rental and sales markets. Through our housing discrimination research, we've adapted paired testing research method also to the study of discrimination based on disability status and familial status in rental markets. We've also expanded the application of that method beyond rental and sales markets to look at home insurance, mortgage lending, and also into non-housing areas such as employment. But my remarks here today, I want to focus on housing discrimination research, not in terms of findings from any particular study, which are easily accessible if you're interested in any given study, but really one of the overarching lessons that we have drawn from the work we've done. And that lesson is that housing discrimination and housing markets, they're dynamic. The forms that discrimination takes and how markets function changes over time. So over the course of our research on race and ethnicity-based discrimination, for example, we have seen a shift, a reduction in door slamming, so a flat-out refusal to meet with a tester, say, who is black, but willingness to meet with a matched tester who is white, and a shift more towards subtle forms of differential treatment. And I think that the clip that Fred shared with us was a really good example of that. So you have a very nice, a very polite landlord or property manager who might very apologetically tell a person who is Asian or Hispanic or black that there are few apartments available or there are no apartments available. They might not mention that 2-month rent special or the fact or that they might actually require, say, a background check. And then when you have a matched white tester coming in, they're told about a number of units available, about rent specials, and no mention of a background check. Just a few examples of some of those more subtle things that, again, that the individual themselves would not actually realize was going on without having that comparison. On sales tests, a white tester might be shown more homes than the matched minority tester, steered to homes in mostly white neighborhoods, or not required to have a pre-approval letter from a lender before a real estate agent would even be willing to work with them. In terms of the changes that we've seen in housing and market practices through the work, those changes have involved advertising, communication, as well as a business structure. So in advertising, a shift toward advertising away from print newspapers to web-based sites on the internet. In terms of communication, a shift toward text messaging, email, web-based contact forms as a way to communicate between housing providers and home seekers. And in terms of business structures and practices, we have noticed, just again from, say, 2000 to our 2010 HDS study, an increase in corporations that own properties throughout a city or region, or really even across the country, that have centralized offices to handle inquiries, and integrated record-keeping systems with which they can track prospective tenants. And so, for example, of how that works, so in the testing realm, a tester might contact a housing provider in response to an ad, learn that the tester's name and their contact information and perhaps other information, it's already in some integrated database system because they had previously, as a tester, contacted a sister property that was owned by the same company. So again, some insights in terms of how the housing market is working has come through from the large studies, and we've seen changes over time. Additionally, fair housing laws, included but not limited to the Federal Fair Housing Act, change as legal protection is extended to groups not previously covered. So again, as an example, there's a number of local and state jurisdictions that have extended fair housing protection to cover sexual orientation and gender identity, though we don't have that protection at the federal level. So this overarching lesson about the dynamism of both treatment of home seekers and housing markets points to the need for research that does at least three things. One, that uses research methods and protocols that reflect the best available information on what discrimination looks like and at what stage of housing search process it is believed to occur. Research that is based on up-to-date knowledge of housing market practices, and research that also focuses on populations, both that have been studied previously and also populations that have not been studied previously, regardless of whether such populations are covered by current law. So to conduct research well in such a dynamic environment and to contribute to the knowledge base that's needed to support fair housing goals, we need a range of data collection and analysis efforts, and we need collaboration among the range of people who were involved with data of one sort or another. So a few examples with this is with complaint data. There's a lot of complaint data out there. I don't know as researchers that we've done a very good job in terms of mining, getting access to and mining that complaint data, both local and national data. But doing so could help us glean insights on the extent and nature of complaints. So which populations file the most complaints and what is the nature of those complaints? We know, as Brian said, that not everyone who believes that they've been discriminated against files a complaint, and we know because much discrimination can happen in a very subtle manner, that looking at that complaint data is limited, but nevertheless useful, especially for identifying new areas of research. As a researcher who uses a paired testing method, it's also important that we collaborate with people involved with enforcement testing, whether it's complaint-based or systemic, as Fred discussed. There are differences between the use of paired testing methodology, but enforcement testing is invaluable to research. It can be more flexible than research testing in terms of modifying and adapting protocols in ways that are more difficult to do in a research setting. It can provide insights into local housing market practices and provide detail on housing search practices that come from actual home seekers with whom fair housing organizations have much more contact than certainly researchers do. Fred talked about systemic testing, so conducting tests in an area more so than would be done on the basis of complaints, but not as many tests as would be done in, say, a very large national paired testing study. So again, the systemic testing is a way to explore and develop testing protocols and extend testing into types of housing, perhaps into areas about which we know little, or to focus on different populations. And then, of course, the larger research studies, whether they're pilot studies or larger national studies, which, in addition to providing estimates of discrimination broadly and insights into the forms that discrimination takes, also sheds a lot of light on housing market practices and how they change over time. We would also benefit for taking a 360-degree look. Let's keep going around the circle of the housing market. So learning much more about the people who control access to housing. How are landlords, property managers, and lenders, how are they trained? Better understanding their incentive structures and their level of awareness of fair housing laws. Urban Institute has done a little bit of work in this area, but most certainly there's much, much more work that is needed. And we currently, in terms of home seekers activities, we currently have a study, the HUD-funded study that is just now getting underway that is looking at about how people search for housing and how that's changed just with the increase in technology available. So one particular challenge for research in rental markets that I wanted to mention is how to get at discrimination, a differential treatment that happens later in a housing search process, and even after someone has moved into an apartment and they're on a lease. So paired testing conducted for research purposes has not extended beyond that pre-application stage. So we do not have testers. We very explicitly prohibit testers from signing, not even getting to the lease, but even an application, okay? Because once they've signed a legal document, that opens up a few cans of worms. So we don't go there in terms of research testing, but we need to know what's happening further down the line in that process. So are there ways to extend paired testing research further in that process than has been done before? And what other methods, in addition to paired testing, might there be that would shed some light in this area? Again, as well as the area once somebody has signed a lease, because we do hear quite a bit about discriminatory treatment happening once people are actually on a lease and living within a rental building. So we need research at a number of different types of research, as well as research at different scales, in large part because things are changing over time. And each type of data collection can support others. I think we need to find better ways of doing so, though, so that what is learned by practitioners, people in fair housing organizations, can be shared with people doing research, and vice versa. What are we learning in research that would be informative and useful to people in the practitioner and enforcement arenas? It's just very important to do this so that we can engage as effectively as possible with this ever-changing landscape as we continue to make strides toward ensuring fair housing for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we still have Kevin's PowerPoint slide. Do I go forward with it? Great, thank you. I want to start by thanking you for sharing your time with me this afternoon. My name is Len Albright. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and public policy at Northeastern University. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some findings from a study called the Monitoring Mount Laurel Study that was published as a book in 2013 by Princeton University Press. The research was supported by the MacArthur Foundation, and it was also supported by a 2009 through 2011 HUD doctoral dissertation research grant. So if anyone that's in the room was on that grant review panel in 2009, thank you. I think that we put it to good work. I just want to mention the co-authors on the project were Douglas Massey, Rebecca Cassiano, David Kinsey, and Elizabeth Derrickson. At the time of the study, we were all at Princeton, and since we've kind of all spread in different directions. Just to give you a roadmap of what I'm going to share today. Today I'm going to present findings from the study of a 140-unit low-income housing tax credit, a 100% affordable housing complex that's in suburban Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Now, if there's any lawyers or planners in the room, Mount Laurel might ring a bell for being famous for the zoning battle that led to the Mount Laurel decisions in 1975 and 1983. This was a series of legal decisions that led to an affirmative obligation of every municipality in New Jersey to meet the need of regional low-income housing supply. So every town in New Jersey has this affirmative obligation to supply housing. So we wanted to go back to where this case started and look at a low-income housing complex that was built to meet this affirmative obligation and see what happened. Were there positive impacts to the housing? Were there any negative externalities associated that that people commonly think might be associated with low-income housing? So I'll briefly review the methods. I'll talk about what was the impact of the housing on the people that lived in it, the parents and children, and what was the impact on the community in terms of did crime increase, decrease, property values, did it have any impact on taxes? Now, our study is situated in a body of research that looks at mobility programs. Mobility programs are nice because they allow us to do a quasi-natural experiment where we can have some kind of treatment effect on people and see, is there positive outcomes? So if we think about the Gautreaux program in Chicago, the Moving to Opportunity program in some of the cities across the US, and now the Monitoring Mount Laurel study, we get to look at when people move from high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods and they move to high quality, affordable housing, is there a positive impact on them? What are the neighborhood effects and the effects of the housing on the individuals and the families? Now, briefly, if there's any kind of methods nerds in the audience or watching online, we think that we advanced and pushed the methods of this type of study. The Moving to Opportunity, which was an excellent study, basically would randomly assign people the treatment effect. So some people would stay in a neighborhood with high levels of poverty. Now, other people were randomly assigned to get a voucher to move into neighborhoods with low levels of poverty. And then years later, we would look, what was the impact on their health, their income, employment status, behavior. Now, one of the things that limits the inference we can make in this kind of model is that people might not have wanted to move out of their neighborhood. Suddenly, people are living in a neighborhood that they didn't want to be in, and then as soon as they had the chance, they move back somewhere else. So this, this can impact the outcomes that we're looking to measure. Now, what we did with the Monitoring Mount Laurel study was we basically studied and we created our control group and our experimental group of everyone that wanted to move into this complex. So everyone wanted to move to Mount Laurel. In general, these were people who were living in high poverty neighborhoods. Everyone was seeking to move to this neighborhood. There was 140 units in this housing complex. 3,000 people came to apply on the first day that they took applications. There was a 6-mile traffic jam of cars. They had to call the police in to come do the traffic, which is bad news for people that want this opportunity, but for a researcher, it's great because it gave us 3,000 people to pick from that we could develop this control group and this experimental group. So what we did was in 2000, people moved into the housing. And then in 2006 and in 2010, we surveyed them to see what happened. Was there impact on their health, their income, and also what happened to the town where this housing was built? Just briefly, for the people who are interested in the methods, it's a quasi-experimental design because people are moving. There's this multiple time series experiment, and we get to monitor and see what happens with people. We call it a post-test only static group comparison. We gathered all types of data. We looked at public records on things like tax rates, crime rates, property values. We surveyed all of the residents that lived in the affordable housing. We also surveyed all the non-residents, the control group, who wanted to move into the housing but just couldn't get in because there wasn't enough supply. We surveyed neighbors of the surrounding developments to get their impressions of the housing and how the community may have changed or not after the housing opened. And we did in-depth interviews and field observations. Now, this can all get a little bit heady. I'm talking about post-test static, so I want to just remind us that we're talking about real people here, and this is what the housing looked like that people moved into. These are the Ethel R. Lawrence homes. This is the typical kind of new urbanist design with the front porch where people can sit and kind of watch people come and go. This is what Ethel Lawrence looks like. It's 100% affordable, basically cul-de-sac, suburban cul-de-sac. If you look in the very, very background of this photograph, you can see Philadelphia. I think if you squint, you can probably see the Liberty Bell. You can maybe see Rocky running up the Art Museum steps. But this goes to show you that this is very much in the Philadelphia metro region. And you can see the cul-de-sac design that's meant to mimic a suburban spatial logic. Just to give you a sense, the small map here shows New Jersey. Within that box would be Philadelphia. And this gives you a sense of the income distribution geographically. So Mount Laurel's at the higher end of the median household income, with families making between $70,000 and $80,000 on median. But very closely in places like Camden City, you have a median household income much below that, $18,000, $19,000 per family. Now this map shows the geographic distribution of racial minorities. Mount Laurel and comparison towns, Evesham and Mincin, are on the lower level with between 6 and 10% of racial minorities, in comparison to places like Camden City, which would have between 26 up to 100%. So what did we find? We did these surveys of families, and we wanted to know what was the impact of moving from high poverty neighborhoods into this suburban housing. So one of the things that and there's good news here, which is great. The likelihood of employment of moving into Ethel Lawrence homes was 170%. So when people that were unemployed that moved in, there's a much more greater likelihood that they're employed. In average, there was a $7,000 gain in annual income, which is fantastic, in part because people, once they were in stable housing, could seek education, which would allow them to ratchet up their income and their credentials. The share of income from work increased by 21%, and the likelihood of using income assistance decreased by 28%. So we're seeing that housing matters here. This is a good strategic investment in talking about dollars for dollars in federal investments. And one of the things that's also important is the anxiety index. We measured people's self-reported anxiety, and I'll show a next slide on that. That was down by 12%. Because we wanted to understand what are the mechanisms that are responsible for these positive effects. And if you look at the second column, you'll see that a lot of what we're seeing can be explained by a reduction in anxiety. And this makes sense because people are now living in stable housing, it's good quality, and it's affordable. So now, people's budgets aren't so tight, it allows them to basically have a little bit of breathing room. When I was doing interviews in the housing complex, I would talk to people and they'd say, when I came out here, I was able to breathe. And when I could breathe, I could start to plan. I could start to plan about, what's the next type of education I want to get, or, what's my plan for my child. So this anxiety index is that exhale that people are they can relax, they can start to plan, they have good high quality, affordable housing. Now the types of anxiety symptoms that we looked at were people, we'd asked, at least once per week, have you had trouble falling asleep, trouble relaxing, frequent crying, fearfulness. And the green are residents of Ethel Lawrence homes. The white bars are residents who stayed in the high poverty neighborhoods. And you see that the residents of Ethel Lawrence homes, much less instances of trouble falling asleep, trouble relaxing, frequent crying, fearfulness. In general, the residents of the Ethel Lawrence homes had a 1.8 anxiety index. So there are all kinds of health benefits from this as well. So housing policy also becomes health policy. Now, we were also interested in children. So we looked at the student and school characteristics. And one of the things that we saw was, again, the green as residents, that parents became more involved in school because they had more time. Exposure to school disorder decreased. Students in the Ethel Lawrence homes spent more hours reading per week. And there was a substantial increase in students in the Ethel Lawrence homes having a quiet place to study so they could focus. They weren't sharing a bedroom with 3 or 4 brothers and sisters. They maybe have their own bedroom. They can close a door, study math. They can prepare for the next day at school. Now, this all sounds great, lots of positive impacts. But when the housing was built in 2000, there was a lot of concern expressed by the community around low-income housing. There's going to be a change in the demographics of this community, and there was concerns expressed that crime might go up, that property values might decrease, and that taxes might go up. So we measured all of this. And if you see that line, the vertical line, that's when the Ethel Lawrence homes opened. And there was a lot of fear that as soon as these homes opened, that there'd be this giant spike in crime, or that property values would immediately plummet, or that taxes would ramp right up. And if you look, Mount Laurel Township is the solid line, and in general it follows the same pattern across New Jersey, is that the Ethel Lawrence homes opened, crime continued to decrease quite substantially even after the homes opened. Now you see a slight uptick across New Jersey, in part that was as the Great Recession was starting. That could be an explanation for the increase in crime, but no substantial or statistically significant increase in crime in Mount Laurel. Same thing with property values. People thought as soon as the Ethel Lawrence homes opened, property values are going to tank, and I'm not going to be able to sell my house. Homes opened in 2000, property values actually kept going up. They followed the regional patterns and the statewide patterns. And same thing with property taxes. If you look at Mount Laurel's, the circles, basically follows the general trends of property taxes. Property taxes in New Jersey are pretty tough, pretty high. They continued to go up, but there was nothing statistically different than surrounding towns that don't have low-income housing. So just to give you a sense of the market rate housing in Mount Laurel, what it looks like. And again, this is the Ethel R. Lawrence homes. When we talk to neighbors who live next door to the housing, who lived in market rate housing, we'd say, are you aware of any low-income housing in your town? And they say, yeah, I'm pretty sure there's low-income housing in Mount Laurel. And we'd say, where is it? And they'd say, I don't know. But then they'd say, every couple days I jog through the Ethel Lawrence homes. It's beautiful over there. And they talk about how nice the landscaping was. And the developer Fair Share Housing of Ethel Lawrence homes doubled their budget on landscaping because they realized how important that aesthetic consistency was in maintaining this perception that this was just like any other housing. So just my conclusion, we measured positive impacts on economic self-sufficiency and health for adults, and that the key mechanism is this reduction in anxiety. So people are feeling less physically and emotionally, psychologically stressed. That allows them to basically start to plan, become more economically self-sufficient, take on new projects, kind of imagine a new self for themselves. Positive impact for children, and no measurable externalities on things like crime, taxes, and property values. So just to end with this is a big hug. These are some of the kids at the complex. And just to thank you for sharing your time with me this afternoon.
I want to thank all of our panelists for their presentations. Let's give them another round of applause. And now we get to ask some questions of them. And you'll get to ask some questions, and you should start formulating your questions in your head. And we have microphones to take them. I'm going to get us started by asking a couple of questions, and we can intersperse your questions as soon as you come up to the microphone. So what's really helpful about all of your presentations is obviously you're bringing data to this issue of discrimination, one which frequently is, or maybe inherently, is irrational. And so the work that like Fred and Diane do help to reveal how people will look at a qualified minority person, a person who presents themselves with the same qualifications, say, as a white person, sometimes better qualifications, and despite that information, despite looking squarely at that information, will still prefer to discriminate, even when someone qualifies for what they're looking for. I want to direct this question to Len. How do we use the Mount Laurel findings to help dispel people's misperceptions about the introduction of affordable housing to their communities?
Sure, that's a great question. So just full disclosure, I grew up in Mount Laurel. And so I recall the 1990s, this period where there was a lot of fear among some people in the town that this introduction of this 140 units of low-income housing would change the town. And there was also at the time a lot of support for the low-income housing. People said, I've benefited from this type of assistance in my life, or I feel like this is the right thing to do. So there was both resistance and support. But what's most interesting is that when we go back now and we tell people, there was no increase in crime, there was no increase in taxes, property values didn't decrease. People say, oh, that's because Mount Laurel is such a strong community. And so there's this kind of assurance that you have to give people that, you have to play to people's kind of ego. It's, your town is strong enough. You guys can do this. Your town can successfully integrate, a small number of low-income housing residents, and the town's not going to change. And also kind of, but then putting it back to people and saying, but this is on you. This is your community. Your community can decide to basically run, or your community can decide to open its arms and support its new residents. And in Mount Laurel, that's what they did, and that's why we don't see, a major change, we don't see a major demographic shift. So the lesson is that these communities have the capacity. Sometimes they might think that they don't have the capacity, but they actually do. So this data can help convince these communities that they really have the capacity to metabolize this change.
Thanks. I'm going to direct this next question to Fred. First of all, Fred, thanks again for coming and for your recommendations. You gave us 3 explicit recommendations, and I think we largely agree with them. And you noted that, one of the challenges tends to be resources, but even if that is the case, these are things we should explore further. Insofar as HUD and DOJ and private for housing groups are doing testing, would you have any major recommendation on how they refocus those efforts? You, for example, described the areas of interest that you focus on, and how you're getting, what, maybe 90% or plus detection of discrimination by using your resources and focusing that way. Insofar as we have limited resources, private fair housing groups have limited resources, would you recommend any wholesale or institutional change in how we or the Department of Justice pursue testing?
Well, I think there's a number of recommendations, and I think they not only apply to government, but also a good number of private groups that do testing, and I think we could all use our resources more effectively than we currently do. It is a small pool of resources that we have to work with. I do think the use of appropriate technology, as I mentioned in my comments, is a key element that is missing from a lot of enforcement programs, and I highly and strongly advocate for that use of GIS mapping programs. There's 38 states where you can do the kind of audio recording that you saw in the clip that I have, and yet there are many private groups and government agencies that still don't take advantage of that. I don't know of too many police departments that don't take advantage of utilizing undercover individuals who are equipped with wires and recorders and so forth, and yet in this area we tend to shy away from it for some reason, even though it's a useful way to get very compelling evidence. So I think there's technology uses that we probably can go for, and I think there's a need for more training. And this might even be an area where research could help a little bit, because what I've learned over the years about how discrimination happens and how you can develop effective investigative procedures, I think that isn't widely shared. And so some research that uncovers that, documents it. You know, the difficult two sides to this coin is that on the one hand, you want to tell the world, here's the way you can investigate these matters. On the other hand, you've got to be careful because you don't want to let the industry know, that the violators know that this is the way you're going to investigate them. It's why law enforcement agencies keep their sources and methods confidential, because they don't want to let the quote-unquote bad guys know how they're going about their investigations. The same concern exists in this area. Just as a footnote, I was asked to write an article recently for Cityscape, and have done so. And what people really wanted me to write about was all the different investigative techniques I've used over the years to uncover housing discrimination. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that, because other people other than those of you at HUD and people in the enforcement community read that. And there's no way I'm going to disclose all of those methods and procedures. But it does need to somehow be more systematically shared with those of us. And this may go to the bottom line point I made, which was the lack of coordination. I have to tell you, just to give you an example, in the New York region, we have 2 U.S. Attorney's offices, we have HUD, we have the New York Attorney General's office, we have 3 private fair housing groups, we have the Division of Licensing Services, we have the state FAP agency, and several local FAP agencies. There is no coordination. Now, if you had a major problem in a community and you had that many entities that were dedicated to solving that problem, don't you think you'd work together to try and figure out how to most effectively do that? And there's very minimal communication between these various entities. So that's another area which I think could be vastly improved.
Thank you. And you're right, you don't want to be like the magician who reveals the tricks to the public and anger other magicians. Diane, first of all, you described the existence of lots of data right now that we could better mine. And I know, and you talked some about the complaint data. I know myself, from this robust set of fair housing complaint data, it might be helpful to figure out, who actually comes to HUD. I talked about how most people, it's a very, very small percentage who come, most people don't report discrimination, that perhaps we could learn from who actually comes through this sieve. How did they learn about HUD? What qualities can we learn about them that they, exercise their rights? So I think that's definitely a fertile area for further research. I wanted to ask you a question about the housing discrimination studies, which HUD supports decennially. They've been great value to us in giving us estimates for discrimination in metro areas. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on how we might change the frame of those? So, for example, we tend to look at them in a metro area frame, But from a public policy perspective, is that really what we should be focusing on? I mean, obviously, the media like to be able to say, here's discrimination as it occurs in this city or this other area, or the Northeast versus Southeast. But is there another way of looking at this that may be more useful to public policy?
There's the green light. One of the things that we've definitely thought a lot about at the Urban Institute is to, again, with the idea of trying to push the method of paired testing into areas where we haven't done so, is to take advantage of something that we actually did for HUD a number of years ago on an early disability study and do more work really of an exploratory nature. So test out a range of approaches to doing paired testing, test out using paired testing in different elements, different segments of the housing markets, really to get a good handle on where should we be directing research dollars and research efforts. And just learning more about taking what we learned from enforcement testing efforts as well as what we've gleaned from these large national studies, and just see if we can push the limits a bit on the actual testing protocols, push them into areas where we have not been able to use them before. So as I mentioned in my comments, trying to figure out how do we get beyond that pre-application stage in the process. So really kind of being creative and being flexible and seeing where we can take it. And so that's a very different model than, say, a very large national study. And again, those have been very useful and very informative. But in terms of new areas, I think that would be a really exciting line of work. And also, I think just having formal opportunities for people in the practitioner, enforcement, and research worlds to come together and sit down and share what we know and help push each other and share insights. I think that would make a big difference.
Great. And I'm encouraging people who may have questions to come to the microphone. I can keep asking questions. I can keep them here late asking questions. So I'll keep going for now. So Diane, you talked about how it'd be helpful to be able to do some examination of the discrimination that may occur post-application, and that's certainly true. We also know that on the front end, our decennial studies don't necessarily capture what's going on, because most of our housing discrimination studies are based on paired tests where people actually meet with a housing provider, but discrimination can be occurring well before that, right? And as Fred's clip shows, people often don't even meet with the housing provider. So there's a whole lot we aren't capturing in our discrimination estimates, and this is actually open to anyone. I guess what I'm wondering, to paraphrase a former Secretary of Defense, this is sort of a known unknown, but how much do we know about that? Do we have any estimate of how much discrimination we may be missing, and any ideas on how we might do research around that, even if we cannot get the robust estimate? And there's so many different areas, right? We were talking about race, national origin, disability, but any thoughts on how we sort of figure out what's out there in space?
I'll say a couple of remarks, and then I think Fred will also have some really great suggestions there. One of the things that we've done, for example, on the most recent housing discrimination study, is we made a bigger effort to capture data at the very, very early stage of contact. So not just waiting until we get into an appointment with a housing provider, when the testers get into an appointment with a provider, but also capturing systematically the treatment that occurs during that appointment stage very, very early on. not to steal something I'm going to guess you might say, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. And there's also the thing that with our testing studies, given the size of them and given the resources, these tend to be one, maybe two touches, right, in terms of the interaction between the home seeker and a housing provider. And so I won't say anything more than that because I think you'll have something to say, but that is also something that has been called out as a limitation in terms of the way that those studies have been structured.
I think maybe Len could help us all with this one, because I think there's an anxiety index that immediately goes up when anyone suggests you can't answer the question about how much discrimination there is in American society. It's not answerable, and if it can't be counted, the anxiety level of policymakers and researchers, exponentially goes up. And it doesn't go up for me because I see it every day. I'm witnessing it constantly and so forth. I know it exists. It's real to me, but it does bother people. And I think we have to get over that a little bit. There's some unique attributes to housing discrimination, which I've described. And I think it may not be possible to get the full extent on any given day of how much housing discrimination there is in this country. I think Diane's best suggestion is that there ought to be more meetings between researchers and advocates about what the agenda should be in tackling these issues, much more cross-fertilization between research and enforcement people, so that you can actually aid, research community can actually aid with the enforcement of fair housing law, and maybe the experiences of the enforcement community can add some insights to researchers and what they're doing. And that has to happen more than it has been, because we've really been in two different planets and not talking to each other a whole lot. And I think that's a mistake. There should be some kind of marriage here. Maybe it's a little loose-knit, but it ought to be some kind of marriage between the two entities, because I think both of us would benefit from that kind of experience.
Great. Some kind of partnership for sure. Assistant Secretary O'Regan has a question.
Comment.
Yep. It's on.
I have a comment, and then I actually am going to cede my question to the person on the web who has emailed for the webcast. I have a question, so it'll get read out. But just on two of the points that you were making on the methodology and the need for exchange of ideas is spurring thoughts for us here in PD&R. One is the use that we have of a nice vehicle for a safe space of exchange of ideas, our internal expert convenings. And so this might be a particularly good topic. We've grappled with the issue of post-application, post-lease discrimination, and particularly in certain types of discrimination, anecdotal evidence suggests that's where it's occurring and not at the stage that we're focusing. And so it would be helpful to sort of gather a group on that. The second thing is just in thinking about where we are in setting the next round of research agenda. We're in the early stages of setting up the next stakeholder convenings. I'm doing that, and you'll be hearing from us because that's how we sort of go about getting ideas on what the most important research questions are in an area. So just stay tuned for that, and I'm going to hand you over to the other. They'll read the question.
Great.
We have two questions that came in online. The first is via Twitter. The question is, does an increase in affordable housing lead to a decrease in segregation?
All right, who wants to handle that one?
I'd be happy to take that question. So the United States remains, quite a residentially segregated society, both by income and by race. Now, one of the ideas with things like inclusionary zoning and affirmative obligations around affordable housing in regions, in the suburbs, is to make sure that there's opportunities for people to be able to live in different places, that people aren't priced out of communities. So at its best, things like the Mount Laurel decision in Massachusetts, you have 40B. In California, you have the California Element Law. These are all policies that are set up to try to encourage municipalities to make opportunities for people who might want to live in these places but don't have the economic resources to afford housing at the market rate. So at its best, I think that there really is potential to reduce segregation. Now, one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there are policies that can also increase segregation. So for example, in New Jersey, there was a policy called regional contribution agreements, which was basically a cap and trade market for towns to sell their affordable housing obligation to other towns. Now that's counterintuitive because, one of the goals is to distribute opportunity geographically, but what the regional contribution agreements actually did was further concentrate poverty and disadvantage. So, these policies can be set up in ways that can reduce segregation or also increase it in ways that might be disguised as housing opportunity.
I want to completely agree. I want to add a couple comments, though. I think there has to be some intellectual honesty in this discussion, and part of it comes from the fact that we know right now, even in my region, in the New York City metropolitan region, you are 7 to 9 times more likely, if you are a low-income white, to already live in a low-poverty neighborhood than you are if you are an African American or Latino with the same income. And so we have this disparity. So would affordable housing distributed throughout metropolitan regions make a difference in reducing segregation? Of course it would, as long as that housing is equally available to everybody without regard to race. And in that regard, my only other comment is I think we have to take, and maybe this is another item for a research agenda, but we have to look at the low-income housing tax credit program and the adverse impact it's having throughout the country. In our region, we looked at 10 years of LIHTC data, and 78% of all tax credit family housing was placed in low-income and minority neighborhoods. In the city of New York, 90% of the housing was put in low-income, high-poverty neighborhoods. That is not having no impact on segregation. That is perpetuating and reinforcing and advancing segregation, and we should have abandoned that strategy many, many years ago. So we have to do something to make sure that program actually fosters more opportunity and housing choice for low-income people of color, because it's not doing that right now in many metropolitan regions around the country.
Thank you. Did I understand we had another question? We'll take one more question from the web.
This question came in via email. Have studies like the one conducted in Mount Laurel been attempted at any other locations?
So I would say that the most equivalent studies would be what you would see in moving to opportunity. There's also some exciting work being done with the Thompson Mobility Study in Baltimore. So I think that Stephanie DeLuca at Johns Hopkins is doing some really exciting work, and I think that she's really kind of on the cutting edge of methods, looking at how we can understand the impact of housing.
Ellen Laurie Hoffman with the National Housing Trust, and I have a question that I've been toying with, and then what Fred just said sort of incented me to ask the question. I'm not sure. I think it's sort of to HUD, PD&R, and HUD policymakers in general, but I think it's important that we make the distinction. Example of Mount Laurel is terrific. Obviously, there were very positive outcomes for the folks who were able to get units there, and mobility and choice is terrific, and it's important to give people those opportunities. But I think we need to make the distinction between constructing new units in non-poverty communities and also saving and preserving already existing housing, which in many cases the low-income housing tax credit is doing in communities where people do want to stay and work on improving their neighborhood. So it shouldn't be an either or. And, obviously, with the rental housing crisis that we have going on, preserving existing housing is an extremely cost-effective way of making sure that there is enough affordable housing available. So I just want to add that to the discussion, that mobility isn't the only way to get at providing affordable housing. And I was just thinking about the 3,000 people, the number of folks in Mount Laurel who didn't get a unit and what happened to those folks in the communities that they came from. And it's important to also invest in preservation. So.
I'm so glad you made that point, but I guess I want to say one thing about it, and that is that fair housing advocates have always maintained that there should be both approaches, that reinvesting in poor minority neighborhoods and improving those neighborhoods is an important public policy goal, and it always should be. But we have had an absence of looking at mobility and opportunity to move to other areas. And I love the fact in the recent issue of Evidence Matters, it says the Affordable Housing Advocacy Groups, Enterprise Community Partners, Local Initiative Support Corporation, and National Housing Trust have expressed that policymakers should do both. And that's great, and I've been in rooms with a couple of these organizations, and I agree they have changed their position, and they are now on board to do both, but we have had a long history of funneling all of that housing into poor minority neighborhoods, and that limits the housing choices of those families, including the ones who want to move to other areas and have the same choices enjoyed by low-income whites in the society.
And I want to underscore what I said actually at the outset, which is HUD supports both. I described the need for us to make smart, strategic, and transformative investments in our inner cities to make them better places to live. And what I would say is that, but if you look at where the choices are, they are incredibly lopsided right now. And so we have to do something to achieve a greater balance.
Hi, my name is Ashley. So I have a question kind of as a follow-up to Len. I was really interested in the findings in your research about crime and about what happened to local housing markets. And I've read some similar research from Ingrid Gold-Ellen at NYU. And I was curious, I guess for anyone on the panel, how, these are really contrary to what the general public thinks about supportable housing and sustainable, housing vouchers. How do we begin to communicate that with people who are in these communities about the kind of impacts that it can have, and kind of how have you done that with your research thus far?
So I guess I'll take the second half of that question first, and that's how do we distribute this information? So one of the things that's nice about this study is there was 5 co-authors. So we've been able to really spread out and make sure that that we've been able to share our findings with community groups that are interested in things like equity issues, but also you have to think about all the different stakeholders in this kind of arena. So also talking to developers, both for-profit and nonprofit builders. So going to a professional association meetings of developers, they can really utilize this information to think about their planning for their subdivisions, how they want to think about structuring their various developments, and then also state and federal officials and also local officials. So there's lots of different stakeholders who are involved who we've tried to connect with. And then going back to your first point, and this is in part speaking from the qualitative research that we did in Mount Laurel, schools became a major conduit of information for people to learn about what was going on in their community, to dispel misinformation. And when we interviewed all of the principals in the various schools, the superintendents, the teachers. They said that a lot of parents were coming to them and asking them questions about housing. And they said, we're not experts in housing, but they had to very quickly get up to speed. And they said that they wished that there was some type of training or awareness that they could have gone through, because they ended up serving this community mediation role. Residents couldn't go to the city's municipality to serve this mediation role. They didn't quite have the kind of civil society infrastructure to figure it out themselves, so they would go to the schools. And schools said that in one way they were happy to help, be a resource for information, but they also felt kind of overburdened by having to play this dual role of trying to educate children, but also trying to basically mediate this entire community development process. So it's another thing to be aware of and to look to. We did go to some community meetings, and in part, that's where I've become really hardened about this process. Mount Laurel in the late 90s was a place that many people were quite scared about the change they thought their community was going to see. And when we go back now, we present at the library, we present at zoning meetings, and we say, look, nothing happened. And this is when people say, that's because Mount Laurel is such a great place to live. And it's like, well, it is. You guys did a good job. You didn't. There was no cause for alarm. Everyone didn't pack their bags and move. People went about business as normal. They made new friends with their neighbors. The parents in the Ethel Lawrence homes are now the Pop Warner football coaches, and parents are on the PTO, and there's been successful integration. And when you tell people that story, people say, oh wow, we really had the capacity to do this the whole time. and then you give a round of applause, and that's what we need. And we need other towns to see this lesson so that people can realize that if everyone doesn't move out of their homes, property values aren't going to plummet because there's not going to be an oversupply. So as long as you stay and you stay invested in your community, a lot of those negative externalities aren't going to occur.
I've got sort of a follow-up Mount Laurel question. And I'm not sure whether this is really a data question, but I'm going to try to make it a data question. Coming from the Office of Fair Housing, I'm not really I love data. I love my colleagues at PD&R. Presumably because I love data, I'm here today. But I'm not of PD&R, so I'm going to ask something of a philosophical question, I think. So there's great data coming out of Mount Laurel, but there are many people who live in communities who oppose affordable housing in their community, perhaps not because of what they fear will come, but because they just philosophically think someone is getting something for free and resent that. How can we address that? And perhaps there is data that may show that there are other benefits to having affordable housing in your community? See, I turned it into a data question there. Yeah.
Maybe I can, I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'll briefly answer the question, and Diane and Fred, feel free to weigh in about interesting data. You know, the kind of the meritocracy American concept of, you know, I worked hard and therefore I can move where I want and live where I want, that's deeply ingrained in the American psyche, and it's a tough one to try to overcome. The last chapter of our book gets at dollars and cents, and that tends to be a much better way to try to sell this type of thing. When families do not have stable housing, they tend to be utilizing more public assistance for things like income, for food. Families are more likely to be involved in crime. And each of these things has a cost, both to civil society and to the state. So this is an example of, you know, housing is a good investment. You make an investment in housing, it's going to cost the state government, the federal government, less money in terms of things like other types of social supports, things like health assistance, things like corrections is a big one. So when you start to sell it that way, people say, oh, all right, great, this is actually kind of good. This might actually save me some money. Then people say, okay, go for it. You know, not to say that we shouldn't be funding other types of social support and we shouldn't be funding health, but, you know, it just shows you what a smart investment housing is. And when you sell it like that, people can start to, the American meritocracy thing starts to kind of go away because it's hitting their wallet.
Two things came to mind, and that was one of them, that there are costs to a community if there's not affordable housing. In addition to the things you mentioned, you can even talk about if people have to travel farther in order to get to their jobs or to get to services they need, what kind of cost in terms of on the transportation infrastructure, in terms of air pollution because of increased car travel, whatever it might be. There's a whole range of costs there if we don't have more inclusive communities. And so in that sense, right, it affects everyone. And the other thing we were talking before this started over lunch today, and one of the things that we were all saying also is this assumption that the people who live in affordable housing, this sort of implicit assumption is, well, they didn't work hard for what they got. And so if there's some way to get that message out, it's probably most, if not all of them, are working hard, working one or two jobs, or have been laid off after having worked really hard and are working hard to try to find employment, or whatever the situation might be, but trying to lessen that sense of there's some big difference in that area between the people who live in affordable housing and people who have not received that type of a housing subsidy. And that's not even getting into the issue of homeowners also get the biggest housing subsidy that's on offer. So,
just a quick little kind of story, you know, and this is if there's any kind of journalists listening or any journalists in the room, the importance of stories. A lot of people in Mount Laurel didn't fully realize who exactly was living in their community, and I was interviewing one of the neighbors of the community next door to Ethel Lawrence, and he was telling me about, there's an assisted living care for senior citizens, like an assisted living center just down the road, and he was saying that his mother was living there, and then he was telling me about this woman who is the caretaker of his mother, and he's telling me this, and I know that this woman lives in Ethel Lawrence Homes. And I said to him, how would you feel if you knew that the person who's caring for your mother, who going through Alzheimer's, and is able to live close to home and provide this care for your mother because there's an opportunity for her to live close by her job? And he said, well, then I'd feel totally okay about this. And that story of realizing this kind of human connection of who is in our community is incredibly important. And that's the job of journalists. That's the job of journalists to tell stories, and also researchers to allow us to realize what are the connections to the people in our communities. And if we can make these human connections, it makes it much more real, and it makes us, I think, much more tolerant and accepting.
I think we have just a few more minutes. No more questions from the web, I don't think. Fred, just a follow-up question on testing. You talked about areas of interest. I'm curious whether or not the fact that you have in New York City, in the New York City metro area, a lot of communities that are contiguous yet very demographically different, whether that's one of the criteria you use to select locations where you'll test?
Well, we look at a variety of census data, but there's nothing, I take in part of your question, is there something unique about New York that makes it possible to do what we do? And I don't think so. I've done testing investigations in more than 20 states around the country, and I can tell you that whether you're in Los Angeles or Miami or Grand Rapids, Michigan or Birmingham, Alabama, you're going to find the same kinds of practices, and some of the data that's available in Census and American Community Survey can be very valuable in focusing your enforcement activities. So I don't think there's anything peculiar about New York. It's just that we're bigger, we have a lot more housing providers, and so we find a lot more violators as a result of that. But I don't think the practices vary all that dramatically around the country.
I use New York in part because I'm from there.
Right.
But I think I was really asking whether or not the fact that communities border each other might tend to be an indicator for where you are likely to find discrimination, especially if you notice like a bright line, as you often see in New York and other places.
Well, as you saw from the example, we often look for areas where you have an available housing stock, an affordable housing stock, and a paucity of one population or another, whether it's African Americans or Latinos. In those areas, this is not rocket science. In those areas, there's a reason those areas are remaining segregated. And the reason is that there are housing providers who discriminate in those areas. And we can talk policy from now until whenever, and unless we stop that discrimination, people of color will not have access to those neighborhoods. That's just a reality. No amount of policy, no amount of research is going to stop that housing provider from discriminating. It's going to have to be enforcement action that stops them, and we do. So I think the contiguousness of areas, it sometimes is insightful if an area is virtually all white and then 10 blocks down the road there are predominantly minority neighborhoods, but you'd have that in Miami, LA, all kinds of areas around the country. So I don't think it's a unique thing, and I think we'd look at a lot of different factors before we target an area, but we barely hit the tip of the iceberg in the area that I'm in.
Great.
We have a
We're
question.
going to make this the final question from Debbie Goldberg, National Fair Housing Alliance.
Thank you, Brian. So I was really struck by a comment you made, Fred, about white people living in low-income housing and how they tend to be much more dispersed, or at least in higher income neighborhoods than people of color who are low income. And it seems to me, there is, I think, a commonly held belief in this country that people who live in low-income housing are all people of color, which we know is not true. But I'm just wondering, both from a research perspective and from an enforcement perspective, whether and how we should dig deeper into that issue and that fact to try and kind of open up the box a little bit. When HUD started working on the AFFH rule and was beginning to develop the data tool that's going with that, there was a demonstration that someone from PD&R did for a group of folks from the fair housing world that was very startling to me anyway. Put up on a map, this in case was Chicago, where low-income white people live, and it's scattered throughout the metro area. And then on that same map, where low-income black people live, where low-income Latinos live, and they are very heavily concentrated in communities of the same race or national origin. And the differences there are very startling. I'm just wondering what more we should know about that, and how we can use that to help kind of change people's perceptions about who lives in low-income housing, who benefits from low-income housing, and where we need to have it available to people.
Well, it's an interesting question. I was equally startled. I think John Powell was the first person I read who actually, he was with the Kirwan Institute at the time, and he was the one who began talking about this statistic. And I was so intrigued because we were in the middle of doing a mixed income housing report that I called the Urban Institute, I checked with Brookings, I checked with all these research authorities. I said, tell me, have you gathered this data on low-income populations by race and national origin? Can you tell me what the numbers are and what analysis you've done? And nobody done any. I was rather startled by that. And, we spend so much time, whether it's with Gautreaux or Moving to Opportunity and other things, studying whether or not when low-income minorities get the opportunity to move to low-poverty white areas, whether they're going to succeed. And yet, we've never studied what happens with low-income whites when they move into those communities. I don't ever question whether someone who's low-income and African-American or Latino and moves to a white area, whether they're going to be able to succeed and take advantage of the opportunities. I assume they do. But maybe we need to learn more about how whites got to those areas, how they found housing, how they, sometimes we put the study emphasis on the wrong area. I think number one, we have to talk about this issue more. I think that's very important. Number two, I do think we could learn some things from studying the control group, so to speak, and find out how whites have availed themselves of these opportunities, what advantages and privileges and so forth have caused them to be located everywhere in metropolitan regions. And the last thing I would say, which is only tangentially related, but I need to say it because I know Brian's going to cut off the session. I think the other area where research needs to focus is we spend an awful lot of time studying what people do, what consumers do, and consumers of color particularly. And I want more studying done on what housing providers do in this country. I think we need to learn a lot more about their practices, not just from testing, but maybe from some other hard forms of research that would help inform the enforcement community and help us figure out how we open up some of these areas more systematically. And so I would like to see a lot more research in that area. But yes, I think that's a key issue that you mentioned, and I think we just simply have to talk about it more and acknowledge the fact, again, honesty comes into play here, is just acknowledge the fact that low-income whites have many more housing choices that low-income people of color do in the society, and that dictates all kinds of advantages and benefits that accrue to that population, and I think we have to be very open and honest about that.
First off, I want to thank the panelists, Kevin and Brian, for all of this and for a very lively exchange. I appreciate that notion of frankness. These are actually very hard questions and spaces to talk about at times, and there can be, and I appreciated the questions in the audience, we have groups who are fighting for very similar causes, and that some of the tension can just be in a world of very limited resources when you're trying to achieve correlated goals. Getting the balance right can lead to some hard conversations, but if you don't have those conversations, we're not going to make that progress. So I really appreciate the tone of that, and you're taking the time, and I can see why Brian has invited you 3 times, Fred, so you're still on the list. I'll make a call out for some research that we are doing that maybe can help a bit on this, but hearing about those unanswered questions is one of the reasons we are interested in running these quarterlies. We do have a study undergoing, actually I think it's with, on differences in racial searching in housing markets. Is that right? So it should help a little bit. So it's not just looking at the one group. And on the, I just went out of my head. The other comment that you made it went out of my head. Housing providers. Housing providers. Thank you so much, Brian. You know the research that's on our agenda. We also have another study that's looking on that side of it. A lot of it's qualitative, but it's getting a sense of how they see the market and how they see the low-income market and what it means for how they search and what their methods are. And it actually has been eye-opening for us in looking at just the preliminary results. And so with that, I want us to have one last round of applause for the panelists and for Kevin. Thank you all for joining us, whether it was through the webcast or here in the auditorium. And a reminder that our next briefing is going to be in October. The panel discussion then is going to focus on impact of housing on children, which is the subject of our next quarterly PDR publication, Evidence Matters. The panelist and the moderator and the exact date will be announced, so stay tuned. Thank you very much.